Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk. On this edition, we're going to talk to somebody that probably many of you have heard of. His name is Rick Whalen, and he's an attorney in town, but he also wears a number of different hats. So I'm not sure where you might know him, but I think when you see him and when you hear his story, you'll figure out that you do know who that is. So welcome, Rick, for
Thank you,
coming
Barbara.
and sharing your story with us today. I always ask my guests for photographs, and that's where how we tell your story. And the first photograph that you sent to me looks like perhaps it's you and a parent.
That's my mom,
Okay.
and that is near 9 Talmadge Lane. When I first came out here, I rented a room with kitchen privileges from Marion Talmadge, who lived on
Oh,
Talmadge
so that's the
Lane.
barn, right? Yeah, okay, I know
I,
exactly
I
where that
think
is.
that might be Charles and Toby's house in
Yes,
the back,
that's where,
which is where Bruce Siska lives now.
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
That's their garage or
You can see the
whatever.
railroad trestle over our heads.
Yep, you can almost see my house from there.
Around the corner.
Not quite. So when was this? What year would that have been?
So the photo, there was a writing in the back of the photograph that indicates it was taken, I think, in 1983. I wasn't living in Marion's in 1983, so my guess is that we went to visit her.
Okay.
He must have visited her at that time.
So was she an old friend, a family friend?
No,
or-
no. So when I first came out here, the second place I lived was, she advertised, in those days, people would have advertisements in the Star, renting a room,
Right.
commonly called a room with kitchen privileges.
Right.
So you could cook something there. So must have had an advertisement. She rented rooms to people. That was how because she got some extra income in her older days. I think she was 89 when I met her. She passed away in 1983, and she was, I think, 91 or, I should know. She would have been 91 then. She was born in East Hampton in 1892.
Yes,
Yeah.
she was quite a character too.
Yeah.
So tell me where you actually were born and grew up. I mean, you didn't grow up in East Hampton.
No.
Okay.
And people often, there's a Whalen family up
Right.
in Northwest Woods. So a lot of people assume that I'm related to them,
Right.
which I'm not. And the last names are spelled differently as well. So I grew up in the Bronx, 196th Street in the Bronx, in an apartment building, very different from East Hampton.
Yes.
And lived there, went away to college at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And that's where I met Tom Rule, who's a
Okay.
lifelong friend of mine. And, so while I was in college, my first summer in college, my parents and another family of theirs rented a house at Ditch Plains in Montauk for 2 summers in August, two weeks in August. And I was spending the summer, I was living at my grandmother's house, also in the Bronx, and working at a McDonald's restaurant on Fordham Road. Not the most exciting summer.
No.
So I came out for 1 week to Ditch Plains. First time I think we might have been out here when I was a kid, like a day trip or something, maybe to Montauk Point. But effectively my first time out. And I spent the 1 week there and I said, what am I doing in the Bronx? So I said, I'm going to come out here next year, my next summer from college. I said, I'll come out to Montauk. As it turned out, I wound up in East Hampton instead of Montauk because it was easier to find a job and a place to stay. And so I came out the following summer, this is the late 1970s. I rented a room in a house owned by Veronica Richard on the corner of Hither Lane and Egypt Lane.
Sure.
I don't think too many people in Egypt Lane are renting rooms with kitchen privileges these days.
No.
But in those days, they did.
Yes.
And that's the first place I stayed. And I had a job at the East Hampton Cinema. Will Markert was the manager, still around. And that was my first summer out here.
Wow. So even as a kid, you didn't come out here regularly.
No.
Some of my guests,
No.
came out every year when they were kids, every summer for vacation, but you were older.
Yeah, and my family didn't have a house out here. I just came out and then I basically fell in love with the place.
Yeah.
So when I graduated from college, this is 1979, I had decided, this did not make my parents that happy, that I was going to come and live out here. And I did not know what I was going to do.
Uh-huh. So what did you do? Is that what
Did
this
a lot of
picture is
things.
about?
Yeah, I did
Show this
a
picture.
whole bunch of things for about 3 years, from 79 to 81. In 1981, as the photograph indicates, I got a job fishing with Stuart Forple. He had traps at Water Fence, just east of Napping Harbor.
Uh-huh.
On the north shore of what's Hither Hill State Park, including his famous steel trap, which had welded steel poles. He was a master welder.
Mhm.
And so I fished that summer with him until late summer, and the fishing kind of dropped off, and then I had to go find some other things. There wasn't enough money. But I fished the summer with Stuart Vorpal. The next summer I fished with Tom Noble, also out of Napeague Harbor. Tom was a gill netter. And that was 1982. And at the end of that summer, Tom packed out primarily, packing out, which is to say shipping your catch. Stuart mostly shipped his catch out of Stewart Seafood Market, which had been established by his father, I believe. I mean, it wasn't named for Stewart's Seafood was not named for Stewart. It was named for, I believe it was his father. And but Tom Noble primarily packed out at the seafood shop in Wainscott, excuse me. And so he basically got me a job. John Hessler was the owner of the seafood shop at that time. And so I started to work that fall at the seafood shop. And that's where I worked until I actually went to law school in 1984.
Wow. Okay. All right. So what is this picture right here?
Well, that was a trip out west. That was a trip in the probably, I don't even know the exact year, but let's say about 2000 or so, out west. That's my cousin Janet. Janet was born on the same day. I won't mention the date, but Janet was born on the same day that I was born.
Oh.
Not the same date, the same day. My mother and her sister both gave birth on the same day.
Wow.
So Janet was exactly has my birthday. So she lives out in the Denver area.
Okay. And this was a trip to where?
That was a trip. That was part of a trip to. That trip started with so I guess it was probably early 2000s. I believe I was there. We did an East Hampton Trails Preservation Society trip, a group trip, organized trip to the Grand Canyon and northern Arizona.
Oh, wow.
A very, very fascinating trip. We were in the Navajo reservation. We met a guy in the Navajo. There was a Navajo Indian who, showed us around, showed us parts of the reservation you couldn't go to unless you were accompanied by a Navajo guide. Very, very nice guy. I asked him at some point because he had an accent. I said, I was thinking, has he ever left Arizona? I said, have you ever been at East? Oh yeah, I was in my the Indian religion. I don't know, it was Meshintucket or what's the other Indian?
Shinnecock?
No, I'm talking about the casinos.
The casinos.
It was either Connecticut.
Right. The two in Connecticut.
Yeah, one of the casinos. So he was a drummer. So he and his wife had gone there. They were as to play. While he was there, he took a trip. He visited Long Island because they had some family relatives. And while he was on Long Island, he took a trip out and visited the Montauk Lighthouse.
No kidding.
So here are more than the guy's ever left Arizona, and within the last couple of years, he basically drove past my house.
That's so great.
So anyway, at the end of that trip to the Grand Canyon and Arizona, I then left the group and went over and met Janet, at her place, and hiked around a bit in the Rockies.
Nice.
That
Very
was in the
nice.
springtime of, I guess, early 2000s.
It's supposed to be, I've never seen it. It's supposed to be beautiful out there.
Yeah. There was still a lot of snow. You couldn't really, this was in May, I guess. So you really couldn't hike in the upper mountains. It was all snow covered.
And the Grand Canyon, I would love to see too.
The Grand Canyon, when you see the Grand Canyon, it literally, it's too large for you to take in. It really is. You can't, the scale of it defeats your sense of proportion.
Well, from this picture, it looks like you're definitely an outdoorsman.
Yeah, well, that's in East Hampton. That's in Cedar Point County Park. Mountain biking with Rudy Lemp, a friend of mine. He lives in Southampton. He was German national originally. He was actually the German ambassador to Nepal at some point. So we were mountain biking, and Rudy took that picture.
That's a great picture. And I'm assuming this is the water, right?
Yeah, so we're near Hedges. We're on Hedges Banks, basically. We're on the trail parallel to Hedges Banks. So you're looking in the distance there. That would be Ram Island on Shelter Island. So yeah, that's Gardner's Bay.
That's a great picture.
Yeah.
I like that one. All right, what about this one?
So that was a cruise down. That was my first time outside the country, actually. I did a cruise with. I wasn't working for the town at that point. This is about 2008, I believe, and we did a Caribbean cruise with some other people who worked for the town, and kind of organized the trip. I believe that's in Aruba.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, that was my first time outside the United States.
Popped around the islands.
Yeah, we did, Aruba and Bonaire and where else did we get? Dominica and eventually to the Virgin Islands.
Nice. Very nice.
So that was fun.
So tell me now, you were fishing. What'd you do next?
Well, so I was fishing most of my fishing was in 1981, 1982. I also had this period of time in the fall of 1981. I actually spent a brief period on a dragger owned by John Steck out of Montauk.
Okay.
But after 82, so fishing, I was the crew. I mean, I basically was I did whatever Stewart or Tom Noble told me to do. But it's seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
And, I got a share, out of, I needed something more stable. And as I said, Tom Noble got me a job then with the seafood shop in the fall of 1982. And so from 82 into 1984, I was working there. But what happened, I got involved in the kind of the environmental movement in the town in the early 1980s from 1981 onward. So in 1982, with Tom Rule, who I met at Lehigh, we co-founded the Coalition for Hither Woods to try to preserve Hither Woods Montauk, at which we succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
But
And that's owned by the state now?
it's
Or?
owned by, the northern part was jointly acquired by the state, the county, and the town, and we believe that was the first time in New York State history that 3 levels of government joined up to buy and preserve land.
Mm.
The central portion of it is now county parkland, that's the Lee Compliment Preserve.
Right.
So the total was 1,357 acres, and it adjoins Hither Hill State Park.
And that's state.
Hither Hill State Park is state. The last part of that property which was not acquired in the 1980s, was the land at the end of Navy Road. Some people call that Eddie Ecker Park. I call it Ron's Valley. That was acquired by the town in 2002, and I was the town deputy town attorney handling closings at the time. So the last part of the land that we tried to acquire, the last acquisition, I handled the closing.
Was that CPF?
Yes, that was CPF money.
Community Preservation Fund, for anybody who doesn't know what CPF is, but that's been a real gift.
Yeah, and I brought a bottle of champagne to that closing.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a gift to East. It still is a gift. I
Yes.
mean, it's
Yep.
incredible what's been able to
is.
be preserved through that. So we're very fortunate to have that. Okay, tell me about this lovely lady.
Okay, well, that lovely lady is my late wife, Janice. Janice Blair. Blair was her maiden name.
Mm-hmm.
And Janice worked at the Amagansett IGA. And in 2002, I started to notice her. She was, at the checkout line, and she just had a scintillating personality, beautiful personality. So much so that people literally, if you had your choice of a checkout line,
You would go to her.
you'd get in Janice's line because she always had, she always smiling and had good things to say and so forth. So, I asked her out on a date. Our first date was at Michael's restaurant up in Springs,
Right.
in June of 2010.
Which is no longer there.
Right. It's not Michael's. I think it's still operating, right?
Yeah, there is a restaurant there. I don't,
it's
off
not-
the top of my
I
head,
know,
remember
it's not
Rita
mine.
Cantina or something.
Yeah, that's
I
something
think it's
like
something like that.
Yeah, I know. I miss Michael's.
Yeah, yeah, I miss
that was-
Michael's too.
that
That
was
was a
a
very
great
nice little spot.
So, and our second date was at the Montauk Lighthouse along the Bluffs.
Nice.
And at that point, I kind of thought, this
This is the
this
one?
was probably, this was
That's
the one.
pretty good, 2 dates.
Yeah, it didn't take too long. Well, the first date at Michael's, we were asking a lot of questions about each other and kind of realized we had a lot in common. Although she was not a hiker, she's not a hiker at all, but I got her into it.
Yeah.
And later on, she's like, Richard, I love hiking. I'm so glad you got me to do this. So Janice was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful woman. I proposed to her on Christmas Day, 2010. And then that photo was taken at our wedding rehearsal. So we got married on October 29th, 2011. So this would have been, October 2011, the photograph was taken.
14 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what about this one? You look,
Yeah, before I leave, I just jump in. Well, that's more recent. That was last summer out at Deep Hollow. That was after a hike in Amsterdam Beach. That's why I'm all sweaty.
oh, oh, and we have another picture of Janice.
Right, so that's the other picture of Janice. So that was one of our we did a hut-to-hut hike with other people, including the pastor at the time of our church, Abigail Presbyterian Church, in the White Mountains. So that's Zealand
Would that have been
Pond.
Steve?
That was Steve Howarth. Steve Howarth and his wife and other people were on that trip. And yeah, that's up in the Whites. That's at Zealand Pond in the Whites.
Beautiful. That's a nice picture too.
Yes, I should mention. So Janice passed away very unexpectedly in December 2016,
so
on December
sorry.
5th. Yeah, so
That's a shame. She does look like a beautiful person.
she was.
Just her her face, her smile, as you said.
Her
was very-
personality, her personality was. I can't describe how wonderful a person she was.
I'm sorry I didn't know her.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about this picture. Let's see if I can get it up here.
Yeah, so that was doing some hiking out in Montauk. That was the end of a hike. That's at Culloden Point, actually. That's Flamingo Road in the background. And this would have been, I don't know, just a few years ago. Ironically, directly behind it, across the street, we've just opened a trail in the last couple of years. That's the beginning of what I call the North Neck Trail that will eventually connect Culloden Point down to the Pominock Path. So literally over my right shoulder, there's now kind of a gap in the brush.
Nice.
And so we're actually actively working on continuing that trail.
And then this picture, very similar picture, but where's that one?
Yeah, so that's this January. So I've had a history of leading hikes in Hither Woods on New Year's Day or New Year's weekend. It's not always the first day. This one did actually happen to be New Year's Day. And I started that around 1988, I believe, or 89. It was originally the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy asked me to lead a hike in Hither Woods. I said, okay. And we did it around New Year's. And so I've continued that. And so this year's hike was, I believe, the 36th consecutive New Year's hike in Hither Woods. So I always lead a hike in Hither Woods. So that's at Rod's Valley at the end of the hike. That's Fort Pond Bay in the background.
And you're not in a parka, so it must have been a nice day.
Yeah, it wasn't bad as I recall.
For New Year's
Obviously,
Day.
yeah, it was not too. It was probably low 50s, maybe.
Yeah, that's pretty good compared to what we've had lately.
Right. Yeah. Like even today.
So, okay, so what have you been doing now? I know you are part of a law firm.
Right. So I worked for the town from 1989 until 2003. I didn't go to the town immediately after law school, but within a couple of years, I started to work for the town. They hired me as the first in-house planning board and zoning board attorney. Before 1989, there was always an outside counsel was always hired to do planning board and zoning board appeals. So I was the first in-house attorney to do that. And I worked for the town for 14 years and 4 months. And I left in 2003 and basically went to a private law practice. And then in 2019, I'm trying to think when David Fowler joined my firm. But yeah, it was before 2020. So I think 2019, David Filer, who I've known going back to the seafood shop days, early 1980s. In fact, when I was away at law school, I was at law school in Washington and Lee University School of Law, which is in Virginia, in Lexington, Virginia. David, who I already knew from the seafood shop, was at that time in Lynchburg College down in Virginia. So anyway, when David came back up north after college, I forget exactly when, he did various things. And then he took a job with the district attorney, the New York City DA's office.
Right.
And he worked there longer than I think I worked for the town, maybe 17 years, something like that. So his plan was always to come back to East Hampton. And so we always stayed in touch. And of course, I encouraged him, hey, when you're ready to give up at the Manhattan DA's office, come back here and we'll join up. So that's what we did.
Great. Now, I know as someone who sat on a zoning board for a number of years, you had to know the town code pretty well.
Yeah, I
Especially
did.
after all those years, you must know it
Well,
inside and out.
First of all, I have to give a lot of credit to the fellow I consider my mentor, who's Russell Stein. Russell was the town attorney for a relatively short period of time. It was from 1984 to, I think he retired or resigned in 1987, maybe the summer of 1987. But in 1984, he wrote the modern zoning code. And I interned with him my 2 summers in law school. So in 1985 and 1986, I worked as a summer intern in the town attorney's office, for no pay, by the way. And so Russell was kind of, as I said, I knew him from the environmental movement even before I worked for the town, even before he was a town attorney. And so I knew the code through him, and then I obviously had a lot of dealings with the code, and most of the changes that were made when we did revisions during my period of time in the town attorney's office, I was always the one who did the code revisions. So through 2003, so some people say I wrote the code. It's not true. Russell wrote the code. I did some revisions to it, but the basic zoning code dates back to Russell's time.
Yeah, and you know it pretty well.
Yes. Yeah.
So in your law firm, is that what you do, zoning and?
Yeah, we do a variety of things. We're trying to expand our practice areas, but I do primarily zoning and planning, land use, and real estate. But the zoning is much more fun.
Yeah,
Zoning is much more. Real estate is boring.
yeah.
Zoning, there actually is creativity and the opportunity. They can approach problems in different ways.
I loved actually sitting on the zoning board. I thought that was fascinating work.
I've always been interested in land and land use, how people use land. It fascinates me. If I'm traveling, whatever, I was worried. I wonder how, what am I looking at? Who owns it? How did it get to be that way? So it's not just a local thing, but
Right. I understand we have some of the oldest codes in New York State, though.
the oldest. what's that?
Codes, zoning codes.
Well, zoning was adopted in East Hampton in 1957.
Yeah.
It had been discussed going back to the late 1920s, but it wasn't actually adopted until 1957.
I think this village was before that, no?
The village was created in 1920
Right,
and
yeah.
had zoning shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
But in the late 50s, as most watchers should know, Long Island began to really develop in the post-World War II period. So the late 1940s into the 1950s, Western Long Island was suburbanizing.
Right.
The eastern towns had always resisted zoning. They liked their way of life with no restrictions. But by the late 50s, it was becoming clear things had to change. And one of the interesting things is, not only did East Hampton adopt zoning in 1957, so did Southampton Town and Shelter Island. I don't know about Southold, but Southampton, East Hampton, and Shelter Island all adopted zoning codes for the first time in 1957.
I understand you're doing an interesting project now, too, about East Hampton history.
Yes.
So you're an East Hampton history buff, too.
Oh, yeah. Now, we didn't show Marion Talmadge. We showed when my mother and I were at Marion Talmadge. So Marion Talmadge was my first interview. I can claim I've interviewed two people from my book that were born in the 19th century. Marion, who was born in 1892, and George Sid Miller Sr., who was also born in the 1890s. So I'm working on an encyclopedia of East Hampton, called the Geographic Historic Encyclopedia of East Hampton. It is a exhaustive, very detailed, and scrupulously sourced history of the town. And there are, roughly speaking, two components to it. There are hamlet histories of 9 geographic areas throughout the town, from Sag Harbor to Montauk, plus a history of the town's kind of politics and governance, kind of a broader view. And then the other component to it, which is even larger, is a listing and history of places and place names throughout the town. But places and place names does not really fully describe it. That includes public and semi-public institutions. Think of libraries, museums, post offices, everything else. Town and village halls. All subdivisions in the town that created at least one road and were filed maps. All places of worship in the town. Parks and preserves owned from the federal government. There's only one federal.
Gosh. How long have you been working on this?
Been working on it for probably about 20 years, seriously planning to publish it. But I interviewed people as far back as I said, as far back as Marion.
Is it anywhere close to being ready?
I'm hoping to finish it this year. I don't know whether it's possible to publish it this year. I don't know. But I literally have to work on it almost every day.
Are you going to self-publish, or what's the plan for that?
I would hope, my hope would be that we could find a university publisher that would publish it, because it's really kind of a scholarly work. It's very large. It wouldn't be something that you would go to a private publisher for. It'd be too, wouldn't have the sufficient demand probably. So that would be kind of my hope is to maybe do a university publisher. I'm supposed to give a presentation on this project to the East Hampton Historical Society
Right.
on February 28th, Friday,
Right.
February 28th. So I'll kind of disclose what the whole project is there. And I'm hoping through the Historical Society, maybe that will also help in terms of, finding a way to publish
Yeah.
it.
Publishing is the hard part.
Yeah, but one way or another, it'll get done. I mean, if it had to be privately published, I would do that, but it's going to be very, very large. It's very, as I say, very comprehensive.
Multiple volumes, do you think, or?
The hope would be that it would be no more than 2 volumes, but they would be very, very large. And then this publisher will have to tell me how to break it up, because
Right.
the Hamlet histories, and then there's everything else that is, kind of alphabetically organized.
That sounds fascinating.
And there have to be maps that go with it too, because,
Sure.
you need to find where all these places are. So
Yeah.
you have to have maps prepared
That's
for it
great.
too.
Well, thank you for coming and spending some time with us. Before you leave, I want to ask you the question that I ask all my guests, which comes from James Lipton's Inside the Actors Studio. Did you ever watch that
No,
show?
no,
Oh, I loved
no.
that show. That was one of my favorite shows, and he had a list of questions he asked his guests at the end. But my favorite always was, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you get to the pearly gates?
Here's Janice.
Yes,
I want to meet Janice.
that would
I want
be,
to see Janice again.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't get to say goodbye.
yeah. That's, you're not the first person that mentioned someone that
Yeah.
they want to meet there. So, yeah, that's, I think I would like that too. I
Yeah.
like to meet some of the people that have gone before. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you
Well, thank
gave
you,
me
Barbara.
here, and it was a great interview. I really enjoyed hearing all about your life and what you're doing now. And I want to thank LTV for allowing us to do public service broadcasting here, and public access TV, which is great. And we thank Whalen and Filer Attorneys at Law for sponsoring this show. So please join me again for another episode of Let's Talk.